Play, and I'll marry you, laughed the millionaires, until the janitor began to play like a genius. In the glare of crystal and cameras, one chance phrase transforms the janitor into a man you can't take your eyes off. Music breaks the usual order, and one impulsive challenge puts reputations, habits, and power on the line. Who will be the first to waver when the room falls silent to a whisper? Before we begin, write in the comments what part of the world you're watching from tonight. If someone had told Marcus Reed this morning that he would be the center of attention in the room that evening, he would have only smirked. His job at the hotel didn't require attention, and he knew how to be invisible better than anyone in the building. That evening began like hundreds of others. The sparkle of crystal chandeliers, the impeccably laid beds, tablecloths, music from the speakers, quiet, not interfering with conversation. Guests walked along the red carpet in expensive gowns. Photographers caught the perfect shot, and the staff seemed to dissolve into the general movement, providing the illusion of a perfect evening. Marcus stood at the edge of the room, holding a tray. His hands moved automatically. Retrieve an empty glass, put away a napkin, wipe up spilled wine. No one looked him in the eye. No one called him by name. Here he had only one title, employee. He had long been accustomed to this. Once he was a man, introduced from the stage, but now he was part of the background. In the center of the room stood a Steinway grand piano, black and polished, to a mirror shine. Every time he passed, Marcus involuntarily lingered. His gaze. Once, his fingers had played on one just like it, and sometimes even better. He could close his eyes and remember how each note sounds, how it reverberates through the hall. But that was in another life, before his mother's illness, debts, and the bias of the music committees put an end to his career. The guests laughed. The toasts followed one after another. Everything was going according to schedule, until a small thing happened that could ruin the illusion. Marcus bent over to pick up a dropped glass, and a few drops of champagne splashed on the light dress of Victoria Whitmore, the hostess of the evening. She froze, as if time had stopped. People stood around, and everyone saw what had happened. "Are you serious?" Her voice was quiet, but there was a ring of steel in it. "At least learn to hold a tray evenly." Marcus straightened up and wanted to apologize, but Victoria didn't give him the chance. She smiled at the guests as if it were just a funny incident, but her eyes remained cold. "And you know what, friends?" She raised her glass, addressing the audience. "This young man seems to think he can do anything. They say he can play the piano. Maybe we should test him." Laughter rang out in the hall. "If he plays better than a professional," her voice grew louder, "I will marry him." The laughter intensified. Someone whistled. Someone added a joke with an unpleasant subtext. For the audience, it was entertainment. For Victoria, a show of power. Marcus looked at her calmly. "I don't want to get married," he said, "but if I play better, you will fulfill any promise, so that everyone here can witness." The hall grew quiet. Someone chuckled. Someone exchanged a puzzled look. But Marcus already knew that this evening would be unlike any other. Marcus stood motionless, holding the tray in one hand. In the hall, the smell of champagne mingled with the scent of perfume and the slight nervousness of the audience, who loved such little dramas. The smiles of the guests were curious, but unfriendly. Victoria, as if enjoying the moment, took a step toward the piano and turned to him. "Well, show us your talent. Or is it all just rumors?" Marcus placed the tray on the waiter's table. Standing nearby, his movements were slow but confident, like a man who has already made up his mind. "I will play," he said. "But if the audience admits that I did better than you expected, you will keep your word." Not as a joke. "This isn't a trial," Victoria laughed, addressing the audience. "But if everyone agrees," the crowd began to murmur. Someone said, "Come on, it'll be fun." Another added, "Well, at least something interesting." For most, it was entertainment. No one expected an ordinary janitor to surprise them with anything. "Sit down," Victoria said with a slight mockery, gestured toward the piano. "Just try not to ruin it." He walked toward the Steinway. Every step he took echoed in his mind. The warm light of concert halls, the smell of varnish and wood. His mother's gaze in the front row. He sat down, running his hand over the lid, as if checking to see if it was the instrument he could once play for hours. At that moment, Lily, The waitress, who had been working at the hotel for 3 years, stopped nearby. She knew Marcus better than anyone else. She'd seen him sometimes linger for a moment in the empty hall after events, quietly pressing the keys, until cleaning called him back. A quiet laughter still echoed in the hall, but it was gradually dying down. "What will you play?" Victoria asked, clearly expecting a banal melody. "Summertime," Marcus answered, but not in the way you were used to hearing it. He lowered his hands to the keys, and the first notes sounded soft, with a deep intonation. It wasn't a loud display of power. On the contrary, the music came from within, as if he were speaking to everyone in the room personally. His fingers moved measuredly, but with precision. In the pauses, the audience's breathing could be heard. The laughter disappeared. People stopped, whispering. Even the waiters froze, not wanting to interrupt the flow. Victoria, standing with a glass, frowned slightly. She hadn't expected someone she had just humiliated to be able to act so calm and confident. In the far corner, a journalist from a cultural newspaper raised his eyebrows. He had clearly begun to observe what was happening. Otherwise, when Marcus finished the first part, silence reigned in the room. No one applauded immediately. The moment was too fragile. "Well, Victoria, try to bring some lightness back into the atmosphere." It was sweet. "That was only the first composition," Marcus replied, without standing. "I wasn't finished." He began a new melody, strict, precise, almost mathematical. The sonata sounded as if each note was measured with surgical precision, yet it contained emotion, held on the edge. Victoria took a step back. The audience was no longer simply listening. They were watching his every move. Some guests began filming. Marcus wasn't thinking about Victoria, the guests, or the hotel. There were only the keys, the music, and the memory of how he once knew how to make people listen. When the sonata ended, the front row stood. Applause filled the hall, and for a moment Marcus was back where he had been many years ago, on stage under the spotlight, not in the shadows. But he knew this was only the beginning of an evening that would change everything. Marcus was still sitting at the piano when the applause began to die down. It was noticeable in the hall that the situation had changed. Now they looked at him not as a servant, but as a man who had just silenced 50 influential guests. Victoria stood with a glass. The smile on her face seemed slightly forced. The pause lengthened, and someone in the audience said with a slight challenge, "Well, Victoria, keep your word." Several voices echoed, but the hostess of the evening was in no hurry to respond. She took a sip, as if considering her strategy, and slowly approached the piano. "You know," she said loudly, so that everyone could hear, "I think we haven't yet decided what it means to be better than a professional. A melody alone is not enough." "Then let's decide right now," Marcus replied. "If you want, I'll play more." The crowd reacted immediately. "Yes, one more, let him prove it." But behind this support there was no real respect, as long as it was still perceived as a game. "Fine," Victoria said, raising her hand for silence. "But if we continue, let there be rules. You play 2 more pieces. 1, classical, to test your technique, and 1, she smiled slightly, a difficult piece for true masters." "Agreed," Marcus said curtly. "But then if the audience admits I've succeeded, you will do what I ask." "Not money," someone in the audience clarified, clearly expecting material gain to be involved. "Not money," he answered firmly, "and it will not be for me." A slight hum of curiosity rippled through the hall. Victoria gave him an appraising look, as if trying to figure out what he was getting at. But arguing in front of witnesses was dangerous. She had a reputation for keeping her word. "Deal," she said. "But the audience is the judge." In the far corner stood a bespectacled man of about 50 with a neat beard. It was David Chun, a music critic known for his sharpness. He raised his hand. "If you don't mind, I'm willing to be the one to say whether this is up to the standard of a professional." Victoria nodded as if that suited her. In fact, she knew Chun rarely praised anyone, which meant the risk of losing was small. Marcus rested his hands on the keys and began the second piece. The first phrase rang out, clear and clear, as if he were drawing a line on a perfectly white sheet of paper. The audience listened, and Victoria stood, pressing her glass to her lips, but never taking a sip. He played without unnecessary theatrics, but every transition, every change in dynamics was perfectly calibrated. There wasn't a single missed note. Even those who didn't understand music sensed that a master stood before them. When he finished, the silence lasted a couple of seconds, and then the front row rose. The rest followed them. The applause was different now. There was no mockery in it, only acknowledgement. Professional level, Chen said, looking directly at Victoria, without a doubt. Some guests turned to the hostess of the evening. Her expression didn't change, but she was clearly seething inside. Okay, she said, in an even voice. One last one left. It's going to be difficult, Marcus warned. I want it to be more than just beautiful, but to be remembered. He began the third piece, a fast-paced piece with rapid octaves and complex rhythms that not every concert pianist could play. Without mistakes, his fingers flew across the keys, but there was precision in every movement. Someone in the crowd leaned toward their neighbor. This is no longer an act. He really lived on this. At one time, Victoria clutched her glass so tightly that her fingers turned white. When the final note, the sound rang out, and the hall exploded. With applause, people stood up and shouted, "Bravo!" One of the guests, an elderly man in an expensive suit, approached him and said, "Mr. Reed, I saw you about 15 years ago at the competition. You were the favorite then." The audience gasped. This was the first time this name was mentioned out loud. Victoria remained silent. She understood that now. Her decision depended not only on her reputation, but also on how this evening would go down in the city's memory. The last chords were still ringing in the air when a drawn-out bravo rang out from the hall. People applauded as if trying to make up for the years during which they had not known who stood before them. Even those who, just half an hour earlier, had been making barbs and jokes now looked at Marcus with genuine respect. He sat motionless, as if checking to see if the energy he once experienced on stage had returned. There was a strange calm within, not euphoria or pride, but a quiet confidence that everything had gone exactly as it should. Victoria stood slightly to the side, her face maintaining an outward calm, but her eyes betraying growing tension. The situation was slipping out of her control, and the audience was demanding a reaction from her. "So," she drawled, stepping forward, "we seem to have to decide what exactly it means to keep that promise. Let's start with you acknowledging that it was a professional performance," David Chin said, not taking his eyes off Victoria. "Undoubtedly." To the surprise of many, she answered, "Marcus Reed." She said his name with a slight pause. "You really know how to act?" At that moment, something happened in the hall that Marcus could not have predicted. A voice from the depths of the crowd said, "Reed, are you the same Marcus Reed, the international competition winner who disappeared from music about 15 years ago?" All eyes turned to the middle-aged man standing by the column. He looked confused, as if he couldn't believe that before him was truly the man he remembered from posters and television broadcasts. "Yes," Marcus quietly replied, "but that was a long time ago." A whisper rolled through the hall like a gentle wave. People began whispering. Someone took out their phone to check the facts. Several guests were already looking for old recordings of his performances. And then Gloria Johnson, the hotel housekeeper, emerged from the corner. She held her hands under her breath, but her voice was firm. "I know why he left the stage. His mother fell ill. There wasn't enough money for treatment. He sold everything he could, and then took any job to pay his debts. And all this time, he was faced with the fact that talent isn't enough if your skin color and surname aren't liked by those on the jury." The hall fell silent. Even quiet conversations ceased. Gloria continued, "He could play in halls all over the world, but he ended up here because the system throws such people overboard. And today you all laughed, thinking he was just service personnel." Victoria slowly turned to Gloria. For a second, irritation flickered in her gaze, but she restrained herself. "Enough," she said, but her voice sounded uncertain. "No," Chin interjected. "Let people know who they just listened to. That's important." One of the guests, a tall, gray-haired man in an expensive tuxedo, stepped forward. "Marcus, I was once on the jury of a competition in Geneva. You played Chopin then. It was brilliant. I don't understand how you couldn't be supported further. Sometimes it's not about the music, Marcus replied calmly. These words hung in the air. Everyone understood what he meant, but no one dared to ask directly. Victoria took a deep breath. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer. Fine. I'm willing to discuss what it means to keep your word. But not here, not now, in front of everyone. Here and now, Marcus countered. Because all of this happened in front of everyone. And those who witnessed your challenge must also witness your answer. The crowd froze in anticipation. For many, this had ceased to be just entertainment. They understood they were witnessing a moment that could develop into something more, a conversation about dignity, equality, and how easy it is to humiliate someone without knowing their history. Victoria hesitated. A struggle flickered in her eyes, between the familiar desire to control the situation and the realization that retreat would be even worse. Okay, she finally said. Let's go to the office, we'll talk, and then I'll come out and tell you what I've decided. Marcus nodded, rose from the piano, and the hall began to buzz again. Some applauded, some were filming, and some simply watched them in silence. They left through a side door, and the heavy door slammed behind them. The hallway was quiet. Only the distant hum of the hall reminded that the audience remained outside the walls. Victoria walked slightly ahead, as if she still wanted to maintain at least a semblance of control. But Marcus knew this. Conversation would change more than just the two of them. The door to the office closed heavily and deftly, as if cutting them off from what was happening in the hall. Here, behind the thick walls, silence reigned, broken only by the distant echo of applause and voices. The office was furnished impeccably. Leather chairs, an antique mahogany desk, paintings of seascapes on the walls. The shelves were filled with expensive books, arranged as if no one had ever used them. Victoria walked to the table and turned to Marcus. Her movements were sharp, but a hint of uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Well, she asked, resting her palms on the edge of the table. What do you want? Marcus stood by the door, in no hurry to approach. He understood that every word was important now. I don't want money, he said, and I don't want personal gifts. My condition doesn't concern me, but the people who work here and people like them. More specifically, Victoria said briefly, as if she was afraid he would drag it out. First, Marcus began. A public apology. Here today in front of everyone who saw how you tried to humiliate me, you will say my name and say you were wrong. Victoria crossed her arms. Is that all? No, he continued. Second, you are establishing a scholarship in my family's name. 4 talented students from poor families, so that they have a chance to study music, even if they have no money or connections. And this will be not just a fund on paper. You will announce it in person. She raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. And third, Marcus said, you are changing the rules at Whitmore Grant. Staff can no longer be prohibited from appearing in photographs or on camera. They cannot be addressed without their names. They cannot be restricted from moving around the halls without a good reason. Victoria paced slowly around the office. You want a revolution? Her voice held a mixture of irony and irritation. I want people here to stop being invisible, he answered calmly. She stopped by the window. Outside the glass, the lights of passing cars flickered on the dark street. Do you understand that this is a blow to the image of the hotel? She asked without turning around. I understand that a refusal is a blow to your personal image, Marcus said, and it is stronger. Victoria, she turned sharply. Threatening? Remember, the room is full of witnesses. He spoke evenly but firmly. And right now, everyone behind the door is discussing not the charity event, but how you treated the man you just called a professional. She came closer, almost right up to him. You think I'm afraid? I think you're smart, Marcus replied. And you understand that it's better to turn this evening into a story of generosity than a story of arrogance. They were silent for a few seconds, looking into each other's eyes. Victoria seemed to be looking for any loophole to maintain control and avoid confession. But her memory already held the faces of the guests, the applause, Hitchen's words, the confession from the crowd. If I agree, she began. You'll leave my life if you do everything I said, he nodded. Then yes. She turned away again, took a few steps toward the table, leaned against it, and looked at her hands for a long moment. Okay, Victoria finally said. I'll do it, but the terms must be stated in my own words. Agreed, Marcus replied. The main thing is that the essence remains. And, she added, come out with me together. He smiled slightly, to show that we were at peace, to show that I was in control of the situation, she retorted. Marcus remained silent. He knew it was important to her to save face in front of the public, but he also knew that from this moment on, control would not be solely in her hands. Victoria took a glass of water from the shelf, took a sip, and quietly said, let's end this beautifully. Marcus nodded. They approached the door. Beyond it, the growing noise of the hall could already be heard, where people were discussing their disappearance. Victoria took a deep breath. Marcus remained calm. They opened the doors and stepped into the light. When they returned to the hall, the conversations died down almost immediately. Guests turned around, as if they had been expecting them to appear. All this time, their phone cameras were raised. Some were already turning on their live broadcasts. Victoria walked ahead, confidently, with the familiar bearing of the evening's hostess. Marcus walked beside her, slightly behind, without a hint of embarrassment. They stopped at the piano, and Victoria glanced around the hall with the look she usually used to begin important speeches. Ladies and gentlemen, her voice was clear. Today, we witnessed not only beautiful music, but also a lesson I needed. I allowed myself to say words that should not have been said. And now I want to publicly apologize to Marcus Reed, an outstanding musician and a man I wrongly underestimated. A complete silence fell over the room. Victoria spoke without a note, but every word was carefully considered. I am obligated to keep the word I give here, she continued. Therefore, on behalf of my family and the Whitmore Grant Hotel, I announce, we are establishing the Reed Family Scholarship for talented students from families with disabilities. This will not be a formality, but a working program with an annual selection and fully funded tuition. Someone in the room applauded approvingly, but she raised her hand, asking to hear the rest. Also, Victoria said, starting today, we're lifting the hotel rules that restricted staff movement in the halls, prohibited them from appearing in photographs, and required guests to address us anonymously. Everyone who works here deserves respect. A murmur of approval, mixed with surprise, rippled through the room. Several hotel employees, those standing by the walls, exchanged glances. They found it hard to believe they were actually hearing this. Victoria paused, looked at Marcus, and added, it's my decision, but this evening is what it is because of him. The applause grew louder. Now without a hint of mockery, Marcus nodded and quietly said, thank you. They stepped aside, and immediately several guests, journalists, and even hotel staff approached them. Some wanted to shake hands, others wanted to ask questions. A dense crowd was beginning to form around them. Marcus noticed that reporters with microphones were already stationed at the exit. Several TV cameras were trained on them. Notifications were flashing on social media throughout the hall and on phone screens. The news was spreading live. Victoria understood that the media storm that had begun would be uncontrollable. Her words would reach far beyond the hall. Some would praise her, some would accuse her of PR, some would reopen old stories, but there was no turning back now. Marcus also understood that this was only the first step. The scholarship, the abolition of humiliating rules. It all sounded fine, but now she would have to ensure that promises didn't turn into empty declarations. Are you satisfied? Victoria asked quietly, as they moved slightly to the side. It's a beginning, he replied. She nodded, as if accepting his answer. At that moment, Chin approached them. I don't say this often, he said, but I'm glad I'm here today. You both have done something few would dare to do in public. Marcus chuckled slightly. We'll see what happens tomorrow. Victoria looked toward the entrance, where the journalists were crowded. Tomorrow would begin the most difficult part. Music began again in the hall, but it no longer had the same background as at the beginning of the evening. Now it was something like a pause before a new scene. Marcus lingered by the piano, running his fingers over the tires and thinking that perhaps he was ready again to play for more than just himself. Victoria, passing him, paused for a second. You know, she said quietly, at one point I really thought you Would agree to something personal. I've been in the shadows for too long to trade this. Chance for personal gain, he replied. She nodded slightly and continued on, heading toward the journalists. Outside the hotel doors, people who had heard about the story on the news were already gathering. Some held signs, others cameras. The evening, which had begun as a glamorous event, turned into the beginning of a larger conversation about dignity, equality, and bias. And no one in the room could have predicted how this conversation would end.